Well, great to have you with us today. I should tell our audience that we are with Ron Ruggiero, who's head of Local 105 for SEIU, and has a checkered history. And actually, why don't I let you tell a little bit? I've got it all written down here. But Ron, why don't you tell us how you got to be where you are?
Oh yeah, sure. And thanks for having me with you today, Governor. Yeah, so I was actually the first one in my family to go to college. So I was in this interesting spot of I was getting my degree in sociology. This was at UC Davis out in California. And you get to that point where you're supposed to pick a career. And I didn't have any family experience with that. You know, in my family, you would just go find a job somewhere. So I was actually on a path. I was pretty good at school. So I was on path to go get a PhD in sociology and become a professor, and was actually accepted to UC Berkeley and had more or less a full ride fellowship for the PhD program. And then a couple of my professors that were kind of mentors to me in the undergraduate at UC Davis said, hey, there's this new program. It's called the Afl-Cio Organizing Institute. It was a pretty much a brand new program at the time, and they were recruiting union organizers from college campuses. So I went into that program. This was back in 1993. And never looked back. I fell in love with the work and the ability to work with workers and really make real change in people's lives. So I've been doing, I guess it's about 27 years this June it will be. And so that's how I got into this work. And I pretty much worked for different SEIU locals around the country for those 27 years. So I feel very fortunate that I get to do what I do.
So what other cities before you got to Denver?
Well, I actually, I grew up, was born in Boston, but basically grew up in Northern California. So I worked in a couple different cities in Northern California. I actually started out, the first local I worked for was in Ohio. So I got to do organizing work in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And then immediately I was in Portland, Oregon for 10 years before coming out to Colorado 7 years ago. In kind of the August 1 of 2013 is when I started with working with 105.
You've been pretty lucky. Those are great places to live.
I have been very fortunate. Absolutely.
So stepping back and looking at the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, what do you think the biggest challenges are facing workers as a consequence of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is, kind of in the short term, and this is still continuing. There's just a number of challenges and needs workers still have. One is around personal protective equipment. We're kind of, I think, about 2 months or more into this pandemic, and that's still an issue in a number of places. I mean, we have heard some, just heartbreaking stories. We are working with home care providers who are not part of our union. We're actually assisting them in building a different kind of workers organization called Colorado Care Workers Unite. So, they don't have union contracts, but, we've heard from some of those workers that they're still to this day, making masks out of paper towels to try to get some level of safety. We have had, within our membership, different issues here and there with personal protective equipment. Sick pay, the governor has made some steps that have improved that situation, but there's still a number of workers who don't have access to paid sick time. And where that really creates what we call the horrible choice, that if you are having symptoms, you either have to make a decision to go to work and potentially infect your coworkers and or the people you serve, which can be patients in a healthcare setting or tenants in, say, commercial real estate for janitorial or at the airport, or stay home and then not be paid and have issues with paying your rent or putting food on the table or paying your bills. And, we've advocated, since this all started, and obviously even before, that really all workers need access to paid sick time, and to not have it in a pandemic, is irresponsible. And I'd say, just doesn't make any sense. I think some of the numbers on it is 25% of all Americans don't have access to paid sick time. So that's a problem. We certainly been advocates for hazard pay for those who have been working. I mean, our members generally have been working throughout this pandemic. And, it gets talked a lot about in the sort of business community about, that corporations or small businesses may take on risk and they should see some rewards from that. And I think you could apply that same logic in this moment, that workers working in a pandemic are taking on enormous risk, their very lives and their health and the health and lives of their family. So, hazard pay should also be getting done. And I would use this to say, what we have seen is, there is a difference with non-union workers and union. We've seen all the press stories that workers in the healthcare setting are being, disciplined, threatened, fired for speaking up on health and safety issues during a pandemic. That's wrong, right? And our union members actually have protections to be able to speak up and advocate for themselves, all the time, and then certainly during a pandemic. And then again, nothing is all perfect in the unionized setting, but our members have actually stood up for themselves and just won a number of, things they need around personal protective equipment. We were successful in getting the airport to provide masks. We still need more, but they did an initial outlay of 800. Our members at Kaiser have actually successfully negotiated a $300 per week childcare benefit. With the schools closed, obviously healthcare providers are still working, and they also got some additional paid sick time, and also some access to temporary housing. So if they get, if they're having symptoms, they don't have to go home and potentially infect their family. So the union and non-union difference, is big. And then the final thing I'll just say is long term, we don't want to return to normal. Out of this pandemic, it's really exposed what's been happening in our economy. And we need to get back to an economy that actually works for everyone. And so that's what we're saying is getting back to normal is not adequate. Normal was not working for, 90% plus of Americans.
Well, most people, I learned this when we had the floods and the fires in, 2012, 2013, that when you experience some of the worst hard times of your life and you lose a lot of what you based your future on, you can't have someone tell you we're gonna build it back the way it was. I mean, just in itself, that's unacceptable. And I think that especially when you're describing the economic consequences to working people that our system has placed. My next question was to look at, especially when you look on this on a national basis, really it's been, rough justice from Reagan, I think at least, but right about 40 years where every single year the middle class has gotten smaller, and the only exact correlation I've been able to find, I'm sure there might be something else, but is the shrinking size of organized labor. And you don't have to be, your son's the rising star in computer science. You don't have to be an expert in computer science to recognize that when you have a one-to-one correlation like that, it's time to address the issue. And obviously, if you believe that a democracy needs to have an expanding middle class, which I believe, I asked, I was 9 months ago, or 10 months ago, I was at the Business Roundtable in New York with 120 CEOs of big companies. And I asked them, how many of you believe that our form of government can survive if we're having a shrinking middle class without a consistently expanding middle class? How many of you think it can survive? Not one person put their hand up, right? So I said, so you agree that we've got to figure out, do everything we can, each of you, each of us, to expand the middle class? They all nod their heads and they said yes. So I think the understanding is there. How we make that transition is going to determine whether it's a fast, successful transition or a bumpy one that, where people make poor decisions and actually slow everything down.
No, absolutely. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, at the height of sort of American prosperity, and I want to obviously note that was a flawed prosperity. It left out many people of color and women, kind of in the 40s and 50s. But using that as some marker, 35% of American workers were in unions at that time. Now it's down to 10 or 11%. In the private sector, it's below 10%. And the way that I talk about it is we have a distribution problem in our economy. In other words, our sort of free market economy produces enormous wealth. But since certainly it started, as you said, kind of with Reagan, late 70s, early 80s, the assault on unions. And that's when the wages and productivity used to rise up together in rough tandem. which meant as workers in this country produced more wealth, they shared in it. And those lines diverged starting in the late 1970s, actually just before Reagan. And now it's a huge gap. And so wealth, productivity, creation of more wealth per hour of work has continued to go up. Wages have been stagnant now for about 40 years. And yes, one of the huge variables there, as you say, is the strength of unions. So we have a distribution of our wealth problem in our society, and the way that we talk about it is it's because we have a distribution of power problem in our society, which is you have to balance that back out. And I think one of the things I know you and I have spoke about in the past is also the dramatic increase of lobbying firms across, in DC to control our political system. You had Citizens United a few years ago, which made that power problem even worse. But certainly growing unions is a key part of the solution to rebalancing that power. And I'm glad you're talking about it in terms of our democracy. I mean, our democracy is actually founded on the system of checks and balances, right, between the three branches of government. It was a pretty smart way to set it up because I think most people agree power does corrupt folks, and that's why you need the balance. Well, what unions do and worker organizations do in our economy is they actually bring some level of checks and balances into the industries and into the work site. And that's really what that does, which, leads to better, pay and benefits being shared out as those workers produce wealth. It also can bring some, greater measures of fairness at work. And it brings free speech to work, which we never talk enough about. I mean, a non-union worker can more or less be terminated for virtually any reason. But union workers, again, have the ability to address issues with management. They have the ability to have a press conference if there are issues that need to get dealt with, and the public needs to be informed. And they can't be fired for those kind of activities. So it's a really interesting thing about even constitutionally, the unions bring something into the workplace that doesn't really exist without it.
No, absolutely. And I remember this weekend I was looking back at some, John F. Kennedy gave a speech in Pueblo in 1962 about the Frying Pan, Arkansas, diversion project to bring water to southern Colorado. And his speech, it was only about 10 minutes, but he spoke about the willingness of this country always to come together for the common good. And I went and Googled a couple more of his speeches, and a year later, he was talking about the steelworkers strike and how it was in the self-interest of every American to make sure this strike got settled fairly, and that there was a way to have a discussion and everyone can have their opinion and see what is a fair wage for working people that are, and if back in those days, steelworkers didn't have a whole lot of air conditioning where they worked. That was pretty challenging. I spent a summer working at the Allen Wood Steel Company in Philadelphia, whenever the heck that was, 1968. So I know something about what I'm talking about. I was a kid in high school, and it was hot. I mean, it was as hard work as I've ever done, except for a year I was teaching. Teaching might be the hardest work I've ever done. But anyway, that sense that we're all in this together, I think is fundamental to our democracy and to who we are as Americans. And I think that's part of why, my next question is this: how does protecting the right to organize, how can that be part of building resiliency during these pandemics or natural disasters or, economic fallout?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think one is that, the erosion of the middle class is what got us to this, everyone living or many people living a very precarious existence. I'm sure you've seen the number. I think it was around 50% of Americans said they could not afford a $400 emergency. When you adjust for inflation, wages are stuck, even in Colorado. I looked at this about a year ago. The median wage was what it was in 1985. And inflation doesn't even capture, this is the official government statistics. It does not cover adequately housing cost increases in childcare and tuition and healthcare. So it's really understated. And that's why there's this, compression of skyrocketing costs of living on most families, and then, stagnant wages. That is just not a recipe for a resilient economy. It makes the economy as a whole much more fragile, because if people were able to save for a rainy day, you could weather better some of these bumps, that happen either with a natural disaster, pandemic, or an economic downturn. And then we obviously have to solve healthcare. That's been another, massive thing that this pandemic has exposed, some of the flaws with employer-based healthcare. So I think when you bring that together, that's how you get a more resilient economy. And I would just add another note that we also don't sort of talk enough about a society, which is, what we call agency. That workers, when they have, organization, when they have a union, they gain agency. We just, we're hearing from non-union workers all the time, and we've heard from workers. One nursing home worker was fired in trying to, warn her coworkers about their risk of exposure to COVID in her nursing home, which is outrageous enough. We've heard from another worker that they were being threatened if they applied for unemployment benefits because they'd had their hours reduced. They were not, they were not laid off fully, hours reduced, and so they were eligible to apply for unemployment. And that's a law that's been on the books as far as I know. Unemployment's been around about 70 years. So when you have employers that will literally threaten workers on some very basic rights that they have, and workers don't have an organization, don't have a union to be able to help them get through that, give them more rights, that impacts all of us. And, that's why I use the word agency, that, for democracy to function, the more people that believe in, have agency, that they believe they, can change their lives, that plays out at the union level, at the local government level, at the state level, and then the federal level. So it's all connected. So that's one, those are some of the ways I believe that, protecting the right to organize, growing unions, is going to, not just the economic benefits, but even on a very personal level of people being empowered, creates a more resilient economy and society.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And the, the things we've read about, workers in the meatpacking factories and the hot healthcare workers having to go and see, COVID, people with COVID virus again and again and again and again and again, often without sufficient protective equipment. It's unconscionable.
Absolutely.
Let me switch gears. We'll come back to COVID. SEIU has started a contract for the annual contract for janitorial master contracts. Tell me why that's important to you, and how do you expect it to go now that we're in this, the eddies of COVID-19.
Yeah, this is we normally bargain, we represent about 2,500 janitors who work in the commercial real estate industry. So you look at the downtown buildings, the Denver Tech Center, about 95% of those buildings are actually cleaned by our members, by responsible contractors. And we normally negotiate on a 4-year cycle. So last contract was 2016. It's when we won at that point the amazing, path to $15 an hour for our janitorial members. And we were set up to bargain, another 4-year agreement this year. And, given the pandemic and all the uncertainty and all the, public health issues with holding rallies and such, we actually approached the contractors and said, hey, let's just do a 1-year extension. Let's address a limited set of issues, kind of being responsible partners. So we're in the process of doing that. We've really just put 3 issues on the table. One is obviously wages. One is healthcare, because we don't want the janitorial members to have unaffordable healthcare in the middle of the pandemic. And then the third area is we've actually proposed some really innovative and groundbreaking language that's around what we call health and safety protection. It would be making sure that, again, the janitorial members have the adequate personal protective equipment, that areas of common use, such as break rooms or time clocks, are being cleaned regularly and sanitized so that the workforce is protected. That then extends to, as they are better protected from contracting COVID, then they're not going to pass it on to as they're cleaning, right, and sanitizing buildings. So it actually will also protect the tenants. And so we're actually pretty excited about those aspects to these negotiations. Because there's no question, all the commercial real estate owners have a choice to either use responsible contractors that are, paying decent wages, and, there's some health care for folks, and, people are protected at work, or they can kind of go the low rent route. And I can tell you in the non-union janitorial industry, it's a nightmare. Workers, again, have no ability to make sure they're getting personal protective equipment. Oftentimes, they're not even treated like employees. We've heard of situations where they treat the janitors like a 1099 independent contractor, which is crazy and wrong. But so
illegal,
yeah,
try
yeah.
illegal.
Yes, exactly. But often people don't approach, the right agencies to deal with those things. So sometimes they get away with it. So we're actually, we just started that process last week. We're actually bargaining again today, Wednesday and Friday, with the contractors. And so, we are hoping to obviously get all these issues resolved in a good way, so that the janitors can continue to be that trusted, workforce. Some cases, these janitors have been there 10, 20, 30 years. They're trained, they have the experience to make sure, again, they're cleaning and sanitizing these buildings, which I think is going to contribute to the public's confidence as people return back to, again, the commercial real estate buildings. And so we're hoping to continue to partner with the industry to do that.
It's interesting. I talked to several of the larger employers. So these are people that they don't own the buildings, but they manage the facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in charge of hiring, of making sure that you have janitors where they're needed. And the ones I talked to, I think I talked to 4 or 5, and to a person, they all said, we're going to get through this, and our workforce is very important to us. And they said just what you said, or at least 2 or 3 of them said that we want to be part of the wallpaper. We want to be, and we are part of what, the different companies that rent space in these buildings, what they feel is familiar and safe, and that they know how the system works and they know how it's going to be. And that when you're worried about people not paying their rent or downsizing dramatically, breaking leases, that's, I think, an important sales point. So at least we're not in those discussions, which were probably a month ago, it felt like that was their inclination. But in the end, they're going to be held hostage by the owners of their buildings. And as margins get squeezed, I'm sure that's why they have good negotiators like yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're, like I said, we're cautiously optimistic. I mean, I would say too, the commercial real estate industry, this goes back to the owner side. They've really have had a massive boom in the last decade. We do the research on this, and the rental rate per square foot has almost gone up about $6, I think, just in the last 4 to 5 years.
Jeez.
And the janitorial costs are like infinitesimal. Usually the improvements we talk about that I've been referring to here, it's like you could do that with 1 to 2 pennies a square
Right.
foot, out of, almost $6. So I think there's opportunity, and, like anything else, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, that as workers help, janitorial staff help produce wealth in the commercial real estate industry because they're maintaining and cleaning and sanitizing those properties. Again, they should share in some of that success.
Yeah. So. And you remember, I'm sure, that when I was in the restaurant business, I got to know some of those janitors as they were first organizing. When actually, I made a donation to help them help start Justice for Janitors, and got to know some of those folks. And it was when I actually did the math, right when I became mayor. I think this is before you got here, but you did the math, and back then it was about 7 or 8 cents per square foot. And we're talking about, even back then, it was $22 a square foot, $26 a square foot. It's way more than that now. But when I went to and I knew just 2 or 3 of the owners of these buildings from my restaurants, they'd come in as customers. And so I just called them up and said, hey, you don't, probably not even aware of this, but these guys are not able to afford rent. They can't live with what they're getting paid. And for this much, you can actually have a pathway where they can get some healthcare, at least some healthcare. And anyway, not one person turned me down. I think it's one of those funny things where organizing transformed the workplace, right? If there wasn't a union that came together and helped them negotiate, they would have kept having to work for the minimum wage with no benefits.
Now, the Justice for Janitors campaign that you had involvement in and helped out with, I mean, it's an amazing story of exactly what we're talking about. So this industry from the 40s through the mid to late 70s was unionized in a lot of major cities. It was actually a very good middle-class job. And then in the late 70s into the 80s, ownership changed. It went from being local property owners in the different cities, became national and even international ownership. And then the jobs were contracted out, and the wages went to nothing, basically minimum wage jobs, loss of a lot of benefits. And then kind of reacting to that into the late, 80s and early 90s, SEIU began the Justice for Janitors campaign. And really our fundamental principle was getting back to organizing in the whole market and understanding that the building owners, we don't legally bargain with them. because we have to bargain with the employers, which is the contractors. But to your point, the owners, they're the ones who really have to make the decision to say, yeah, we'll pay a little bit more for our janitorial services for people to have better jobs. And so it's just kind of like ebb and flow in one industry where the jobs have become better jobs, with this wrinkle in the middle of the late 70s and early, into the
Right.
early. So it's a great example of, like, again, the difference that unions can make for working people. And again, raising wages, sharing in a little bit more of that wealth that workers produce.
Right. So tell me a little bit about the relief packages we've seen coming out of Congress that have passed, and what does that? What's your opinion of those packages? I think I know. And what should the next relief package include to be good for workers? Let's just say that if it was going to be good for workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of the things that were done, were obviously helpful, but again, it's not enough. I mean, you expect workers to get by on a one-time $1,200 payment. That's inadequate. We do think some of the stuff done with unemployment was good. I think, we still have the problem of, though, you really had trillions of dollars that were given out to sort of large corporations and the wealthy. I think there was a $90 billion tax cut that was kind of snuck in there. That was, 80% of that was going to go to people who made millionaires and above. That should not have happened. And then in contrast, by our best estimates, about 300 billion was sort of on the worker side compared to trillions on the other side. So we would say going forward that it just has to be focused on how do we help workers. That should be front and center. We definitely support, the Democrats in the House have passed the HEROES Act, which would kind of ensure personal protective equipment would have hazard pay. I think that's the one that has the $2,000 per month that would be paid out to folks as well to kind of stimulate the economy and get people through the difficult, remaining months of this thing. So those are the kind of things that have to happen. And then I do have to call attention. There has been a glaring omission around, undocumented immigrants. We rely upon them to do critical jobs across our economy. You're talking millions of workers. And they really don't have access to the $1,200 payment or unemployment insurance. And that is and despite anyone's feelings on that issue, you can't run away from the fact this is a workforce that is critical to our economy. And again, is helping to produce wealth in our society and for corporations and those at the top. And they need to be included in all the relief efforts that happen. Not to mention, it also creates a public health issue. Whenever you have desperate people, you're going to kind of have to now seek work wherever they can if they're sick or otherwise. That's just not good in terms of when you're trying to control a pandemic. So that's another priority of ours, to make sure it covers all workers. And what we've seen, I think, I know you're familiar with it, but for those watching, Trump and Cory Gardner and, Mitch McConnell in the Senate are opposing the HEROES Act, which would be very good for workers. So we are, we are telling our members about this. People are putting calls into Senator Cory Gardner's office. And I will say that, our members, and I really think all working people, are going to remember who is on their side in this moment. I've been out here 7 years and I've heard it's only grown louder. What our members, who are a really good cross-section of working class Americans, their number one thing is, I want someone in office who's going to fight for me. And so when Cory Gardner, is against things that are clearly going to help workers in the middle of a pandemic, there's going to be a reckoning. And our folks, and I think all working people, are going to remember in November of who was on their side and who wasn't.
Right. And I think that gets us to the closing question, which, as always, it seems every conversation closes. How important is this election to you in November?
I'm 49. Well, I turned 50 in December this year. I've been saying it for at least 20 plus years. This is the most important election of our lifetime. I think, our perspective on it is a couple things. We do have a very, problematic president, to be polite about it, in the White House that is upending, fundamental bedrock issues around our democracy. He's had an economy that gave, again, I think it's $1.8 trillion tax cut, which Senator Gardner also supported, to billionaires and large corporations. And, my sort of tagline on this, I'm sorry, is that rich people don't need no more help from the government, right? That any help the government's doing should be going to the middle class and the working class in this country. And the other thing is we are at a point, I think, in our history where we need bold action. I know that's what our members want, that again, this pandemic has exposed so many issues. Our economy was already broken. The recovery was a false recovery. It was not really lifting wages. Americans still had very precarious existences. That's all got to change. We still have very pernicious issues around structural racism. I mean, you've seen how this pandemic, both from a health perspective, is hitting communities of color and people of color harder. Economically, it is hitting women, people of color harder. And that's all based on the issues around structural racism that we finally have to address in this country. And as a white person, I always say that we don't talk enough about that ending structural racism would actually benefit everybody. And people kind of look at you weird. How can you say that? Well, one simple way is the only way that working people in this country have ever gotten ahead is when we've rejected the divide and conquer politics. We've rejected the scapegoat politics that some politicians want to offer throughout our history, including now. And we actually come together across our differences and unite. And that's the only way that working class and the middle class actually have enough power to do what we've been talking about during this whole conversation, which is restore some basic fairness on how wealth gets distributed so we can have rising incomes again, rebuild the middle class, and all the other, restore our democracy. You look at the labor movement, that's how it was born. It was when workers who were very different than each other came together in unity. That's how we won, an important civil rights for a lot of folks. It's how we won health and safety protections on the job. So history shows that what I'm talking about is accurate, and that's how working people can actually progress in this country, is when we come together across difference. And that's why our union is firmly committed to, we need economic justice, we need racial justice. And you can't win one without the other. And that's the real lesson that we're always trying to get out to folks, is those struggles for justice have to be linked. It's the only path that we're going to win both. And they got to be done together. And that's, the way our president, Mary Kay Henry, talks about it, our national president, is we need to build the most inclusive middle class that this country has ever seen. Because we can't ignore that we had a strong middle class, 50 years ago, but it left out a lot of people. We can't repeat that mistake. And that's kind of why we talk about coming out of this pandemic. We don't want to go back to normal. Let's create a new normal that, again, actually works for all working Americans, and most Americans, not just the wealthy few. That's what we got to create coming out of this. And that's why this election is critically important.
Hear, hear. And that gets right back to John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and how passionate they were, not just for working people, but for racial justice.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, I got to let you go, but I appreciate you very much, all the work you've done in our community, and I appreciate the time you shared with us this afternoon.
Yeah, well, thanks for talking with me today, and good luck in the campaign, and appreciate everything you've done on behalf of Colorado for the last several decades. So appreciate being with you today.
Thank you so much. We'll stay in touch,
right.
And I'll check with Teddy.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you later. Thanks.